Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I'm your host, Brian Scott. Today we're returning to Manly P. Hall. We've covered Manly P. Hall before through several different fascinating lectures. Most of them are esoteric in nature, dealing with the secret doctrine and origins of the book of Revelation. But today we're going to cover something a little different. I found it interesting that Manly P. Hall did a lecture on how to attract money and use it wisely. This is a completely different perspective on attracting money and using it from the esoteric perspective. Manly P. Hall was an amazing scholar who had access to a variety of secret teachings and discussed secret societies and a variety of very difficult to understand topics. So it's interesting when he discusses something like money and how to attract it. How to attract money and use it wisely by Manly P. Hall. This morning we are going to become involved in an extremely difficult and sticky situation, and that is the general subject of money. I don't know of any way to approach this philosophically in a more interesting manner than to go back to Egypt in ancient times. We're not sure that the monetary system originated in Egypt, but it was certainly functioning there 2,000 or 3,000 BC. And because the Egyptians were rather wise and interesting people, their opinions on this subject, while symbolical, I think are worthy of consideration. In Egypt were introduced the earliest bankers. In the old days, they didn't call them bankers, they called them money changers, and this was a highly respectable occupation. In ancient times, most localities, cities, and countries had their own currencies, and when they traveled, their citizens from one country to another, the individuals had to change their money before they could spend it in a foreign country. So at the gate of the city was the money changer. He was seated behind the table or counter and had in his mind or in adequate notes the relative values of all currencies. And as the stranger came to the gate of the city, if he intended to spend money therein, he had to get the local currency. This was no great problem, and for the most part, the system worked very well. Occasionally, however, one of these money changers misbehaved. He could do several things. Many of those who came to him to exchange their coins did not know the prevailing rates for all the communities, and it's quite conceivable that occasionally the money changer shortchanged the customer. This was considered unethical even at that time, and if a money changer was discovered to be dishonest, they took his table on which he had his various instruments and materials laid out and smashed it. Now at that time, the table was called a bank, and the word bank means a table primarily. To break a table was to rupt it. So a dishonest money changer went bankrupt when his table was broken. And this is the origin of the term, and you can check it in the dictionary. It was still perfectly acceptable. Now the money changer in himself was usually a good-natured soul. For the most part, he was dominated by religious teachings of the community in which he functioned, and so it happens that a philosophy dealing with this phase of life was developed at an early date. If a money changer was honorable, honest, and a little on the generous side if possible, especially for the widow's mite and the coinage of the underprivileged, and the time came for him to die, he presented himself, or his soul was presented for him by the guardian of the gates of the other world, and he was taken into the hall of the great judgment, where the sacred ritual of the judging of the souls of the dead was performed. The judgment consisted of a court consisting of assessors or jurors, and this is the origin of our jury system in law, and was presided over by Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and the judge of the dead. Each applicant for admission into the afterlife was required to recite the negative confession of being. This negative confession has been declared to be one of the most astonishing documents in the history of mankind. And it is assumed that very few of those who appeared before the judge of the dead could possibly meet the requirements of this negative confession honestly. But as the jurors were deities who could read the hearts and minds of men, the person under consideration had to be reasonably accurate. Now, among the 100 statements of the negative confession, the soul of the departed had to be able to say honestly that never in his life he had cheated any man. That's a pretty big thing to say. He also had to say that without any question of doubt that he had been charitable, that he had helped the widow and the fatherless, that he had used his position as money changer for the benefit of the community. He was permitted to make a small change for the money changing, and that was all he was entitled to. If he was reasonably innocent, he might well be allowed by the jurors to pass into the afterlife. If there were some doubts, but on the whole he was pretty good, then Horus, the beloved son of Osiris, interceded for the soul of the dead, saying that he would carry the punishment or bury it, and the soul should be permitted to go into the afterlife. What happened to those who fail utterly is not part of the present story, but they met a proper and appropriate reward or penalty. Having entered into the afterlife, our honest money changer was then permitted to set up his table at the gate of heaven, and those who came in from all different directions had to change their money at his table because the coinage of the mortal world was not accepted in the heavenly region. It was of no value over there. So it had to be transformed into a medium suitable to the life beyond the grave. I think is a very ingenious thought, and of course, what did the individual bring with him? He couldn't bring the cash, that was obvious. What was the coin they could carry into the afterlife and have been exchanged for a blissful existence? That coin is, of course, his own merit. The only coin that was acceptable was his own conscience, his own integrity, and his own fitness. He had to be rewarded according to his works and had to receive a medium of exchange that was acceptable in heaven. This, of course, gives us a very good symbolic idea. It was necessary that he saved up his treasures for the other life. He had to come bearing the necessary symbols which entitle him to the reward which he had earned. So the transformation of the currency represented the rewarding of virtue and the changing of worldly wealth into a spiritual equivalent. This spiritual equivalent was his own character. It was his own merit and sometimes demerit. But if he was a good man and brought his proper coinage, he received the tokens of the other world, a world beyond the grave, and he was then allowed to go in and invest or expand his accumulated spiritual wealth for the comfort and continuance of his after-death state. Now, this is interesting because it tells us a lot about psychology. The individual who was the money changer continued to be a money changer. He passed on. They didn't put a halo on him or crown him into the group of the celestials. He continued to live as he had lived in this world, but it was no longer a material world. It was that kind of world which the ancients considered to be the kind of sleep, and as we learned in the soliloquy of Hamlet in The Sleep of Death, what dreams make shall give us pause. In other words, the whole thing was an internal experience. The money changer had his experience. If he was honest, he continued to do the things he was fitted to do. He continued to build his experience from the previous life, and he would carry forward into the next life the merits, the internal spiritual experience and maturity which he had gained through honest dealings. This type of thought brings us very much into the psychological area, namely that success and failure, wealth and poverty, justice, reward and penalty are mysterious experiences of the inner life, the life which we all must face between embodiments, and our condition is determined by ourselves. When a farmer entered into the great Amentet, the Elysian fields of the blessed, he did not become a politician or a philosopher or a theologian. He was given a beautiful allotment of land, and here he was also given a sickle to work the field. And he worked it with a plow, and the celestial Nile never failed to irrigate his land. And he became a happy and well-adjusted farmer because he was what it was. This does not mean that all life ends in farming. It means, however, that all life is a rewarding accomplishment, and the individual being permitted by his own virtue to fulfill his own life constructively, beautifully, and unselfishly. This was the law of Egypt. This was the concept behind the development of a belief in the exchange of worldly goods. Now, on a more prosaic and more material level, we also know that the Egyptians had their own way of handling barter. Barter was the earliest form of exchange, and barter was the basis of our monetary system. In very ancient times, barter was an exchange of like for like in value, if not in commodity. If a man had a flock of sheep and he wished to barter one or more of the sheep for something else that he needed or wanted, he went to the common market, and in many countries, even today, barter is very largely the basis of all transactions. So he would drive a couple of sheep to town and exchange them for a cow or clothing or for whatever he needed. Now, there's one point in this that's very important. In the barter system of that time, It was up to the original owner to protect the value of that which he hoped to exchange for something else. If the farmer, anxious to make a few extra dollars, did not feed his sheep, and they came scraggly and poor and thin into the market, he would get very little for them because they were not kept up. Therefore, it was up to him to make sure this collateral was in good condition, and if he took proper care of his own goods, then it could be exchanged for goods of equal quality. This placed a kind of censorship upon all transaction, because if the sheep was not properly cared for, it was simply not a serviceable instrument of exchange. When an Egyptian decided to buy something, he went to the shop where he could get what he wanted, and when the transaction was finished, he was given a little clay tablet, 2 or 3 inches square. Into this tablet he impressed his signet ring. The signet ring was his bond. Now, the dealer who secured the signet stone had several possibilities. He could, of course, change it with some other dealer for something else he wanted, and the token became a medium of general exchange. If, however, he did not wish to barter it, he could take it to the house of the owner, or the person who had given it to him, and at the door of the house was the steward, usually seated. The steward accepted the token and gave the merchant its equivalent in coinage, or whatever he needed. There was never any question as to the integrity of the transaction. Somewhere in our collection upstairs, we have one of these token bills pressed upon clay. It was a sign of honest and proper transaction, and the person who received it had no doubt about it being redeemed, nor did anyone throw his hands up past. It was known beyond doubt that the original man who put his seal upon it was honorable, honest, and capable of meeting the indebtedness. Thus, we have the beginning of a medium of exchange. Gradually, it became obvious that bringing sheep to market to change for something else was a rather complicated procedure, so it became necessary to develop some form of symbolic medium of exchange. Every nation of antiquity developed such types of material. There are coins that came down to us that are cast in glass from very ancient dates. There are others that were cut into stone. Some were made into porcelain and other various proper symbols. American Indian wampum, beadwork, the cowrie shell of the South Pacific, all of these were mediums of exchange. In early Virginia colony, a bundle of tobacco leaves was currency. All these different forms were intended to facilitate transactions, and when it became complicated that no one could really bring all his produce to market himself, then it became very important that we have a token by which he could claim payment, or by which he could give payment. These tokens multiplied and became more and more complicated, but in every instance the token served only one purpose. It stood for value. It represented a legitimate monetary or financial or commercial value. It was given as a symbol of an object. Now, for instance, we have what we call day chattel mortgages. The word chattel, if you look it up, means cattle, and a chattel mortgage was indebtedness placed upon a herd of animals. Of course, today, it would be rather difficult and embarrassing to drive a herd of cows into a bank. But still, in ancient times, always one thing was true. The token, whatever it was for value, and that value was fixed by commodity patterns of the time. There was no escaping from the simple fact that the token of itself had no value. That little lump of clay wasn't worth anything. The dollar bill cost to make it only a fraction of a cent. It has no value in itself. It is a symbol of value. Now, as long as it remained a symbol of value, we had a comparatively honorable state of exchange. As long as this symbol was not expected to be a thing of value, but was only a symbol of a personal relationship, either through purchase or sale, as long as this continued, things were relatively honest. Gradually, however, a change took place. In this change, the commodity, the token, began to be regarded as valuable in itself. It was possible to accumulate these tokens, and by accumulation of them, to declare to others that we possessed a pint of wealth. When a knight in the Middle Ages got short of change, he took his armor or his helmet to the armorer, the man who made it, and he would loan him a little money on it temporarily. This again was only a form of barter. The collateral was held against the payment of the debt, but the collateral had no value other than a symbol of ethical transaction. When the early Dutch settlers in the south of Manhattan Island got together under a tree to form a benevolent association on mutual protection, it was the beginning of the stock exchange. That's how it all started. It was always a use of some convenient symbol by means of which transactions could be made more rapidly and more certainly and honorably. Gradually, the theory of accumulation took over, and of course, this theory of accumulation went head-on into the Egyptian philosophy of life, namely that whatever you accumulated could only be with you for the duration of your present existence. Some of the Druids of Britain are said to have borrowed money in one lifetime and guaranteed to pay it back in a later embodiment. This system will never become generally popular, but the theory was always the same, that we had to have some way of dealing with each other in the necessities of life. One man raised upon another man the goods, the cloth, and the corn were values. The man who brought the corn changed it for yardage. This went on until finally we forgot the fact that the medium of exchange was a completely physical instrument. It had very little to do with anything except that it was intended to be a way of handling a transaction. This gradually resulted in the concept that the coinage was something of eternal value, something that could be hoarded and something that could be passed on from one generation to another, and that finally superiority in this life was symbolized by coinage. Now, in the old days, of course, coinage was not a symbol as it is to us. Looking back on the tales and legends of great wealth in antiquity, most of this great wealth was in the hands of persons who had forgotten their own mortality. They had forgotten that they could not take it with them. They had learned, as they learned in Greece, that to pass it on to your descendants was one of the most dangerous procedures in the world, because in most cases it became a detriment upon the descendant. It prevented the descendant from going out and earning his own way. It prevented him from becoming a useful citizen, cooperating with others for the benefits of his society. He became an aristocrat simply because he accumulated little marks based on tablets or clay, or printed on the face of money. All this changed our psychology of life, and gradually out of what we termed the profit system, there has evolved the physical economic complexity which we know today. We have forgotten that we are not here primarily to accumulate. If we were going to live forever, it would be different, but in this foreverness of the higher world of things, the coinage cannot be considered immortal. It is part of a very simple procedure, a procedure of food, clothing, shelter, a procedure of guaranteeing the necessities of life by earning them, and by earning them to gain the tokens or symbols by which we can meet our responsibilities. In those days, there was no idea whatever of money making money. Money was used by the person who earned it to meet the requirements of his society and to carry himself rather to become a dependent upon society. As we went along in this particular problem, another situation appeared almost immediately, and this is very intriguing. The moment a standardized form of currency came into existence, two things happened. Maybe both, or at least one of them. One was that this currency could be devalued. The Roman emperors, when they got into financial trouble, instead of issuing silver coins, made their coins of copper and coated them with silver. It seems to me that happened around here not too long ago. Gradually, the coin no longer had a factual value. Now, as its moral and ethical value declined, its factual value became more obviously important in commerce. It became necessary that the coin itself be of some substance equal in value to the debt. The second thing that could happen, and did happen frequently, was both the coinage and the currency or paper money was counterfeited. Now, counterfeiting began at a very early time. It became part of our way of life as soon as it became obvious that it was profitable. The earliest paper money that we have any record was issued in China during the Ming Dynasty around 1200 to 1300 AD. This paper money was about the size now of a typewriter sheet. It was marked with seals and various symbols of authority, and it contained its value stated in terms of strings of cash, pictures of strings of small money. On each of these notes appeared the statement that anyone guilty of counterfeiting one of these bills would be shortened by the length of one head. But needless to say, this was not discouraging, because counterfeiting continued and passed from one nation to another. Today, most coinage has been counterfeit in some way because of it being profitable. It was a falsification. It was a definite act of dishonesty, but it was tolerated. The culprit was punished, but the process went on. So the paper money got to be in bad repute in China as early as 14th century, and from there on to the establishment of the Republic by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, paper money was practically never circulated in China. No one trusted it because it was worth nothing in itself. You couldn't eat it. It wouldn't even make a very small fire if you tried to burn it. It was of comparatively no value unless behind it was a staple system of financial integrities. In China also, coinage was variously adulterated. A shrewd Chinese would take a bag full of small silver coins and get one of his younger children to shake that bag by the hour. At the end of a certain length of time, the shaking caused little shavings of the silver to separate. He then washed the bag and cash the profit. In China also, large silver coins were cut through horizontally, hollowed out and sealed again. Within the past 50 years, Chinese banks put purple stamps of dollars and other larger coins to prove they had not been tampered with. Even in this country, many farming banks and small businesses would never give change for a silver dollar without dropping the dollar on a piece of marble set into the front of the cash register to hear it ring to make sure that it was genuine. So counterfeiting came in, and counterfeiting, however, was of no value and no profit unless there was a genuine article. A counterfeit has to be based upon a value, and counterfeiting goes on. In the papers a few days ago, a counterfeiting ring was broken up. Thus, money began to get all kinds of nasty appearances, not because it had anything to do with the bill or the silver, but because of those evil ones who lay in wait for it. Someone asked Plato once why the gold was such a pale metal, and he answered, because it fears those who seek to possess it. The paleness is terror. Actually, the gradual development of the situation resulted in the rise of a great theory of money. This theory of money became the basis, practically, of human society, and within the last 50 years, the mistake has become obvious. We're finding ourselves captured in an economic problem which no one has yet seems to be able to solve, and that is the problem of considering a medium of exchange as a capital gain in itself. Materialism, of course, has always nourished the concept of wealth. Now, wealth thoroughly and basically was considered in ancient times as a process in merit. Wealth was the individual reward for individual industry. Wealth was necessary to a measure, and it is still necessary to a measure. Wealth was actually an inducement to produce. It was an incentive to excel in some field of activity. This excellence might be in the making of a violin or in the development of some useful commodity. Actually, wealth in ancient times was closely associated with art and very closely associated with religion. It was a symbol of value, and this value was assumed to be a product of individual integrity. The individual was proving his ability through his own productivity. This productivity separated him from the indolent. The individual who has no concern for value wishes to live without work, always to get by with as little labor and as larger profit as possible, must inevitably corrupt a system. He is not fulfilling his responsibility. Another rule of ancient Egyptian finance was that in the other life, the individual had to prove merit. He had to prove that his life had been in some way a contribution to public good. He had to have done something that was of service to others rather than himself. He had to have so lived that the world was a little better for the fact that he had lived. If his actions were such that the world was a little bit worse because he had lived, then he could not pass the final judgment. Today we are in a very complicated situation economically, and all the legislation in the world probably cannot solve it. It is to go back to where all responsibility in human affairs rests, and that is the human being. The highest form of wealth was pointed out in Egypt is integrity. This was the one commodity. Integrity involved both honesty and intelligence. The individual who is dishonest is making one serious mistake, and another person who is unintelligent in the use of what he has is making another mistake. His non-intelligence is contributing to the delinquency of other people. All of the principles involved are simple. The difficulty is to find an instrumentation for them. We have to find some method in this world by which principles are given an opportunity to guide human conduct. As time went on, and goes on today, there has also been a great change in the attitudes of people toward life. Even in our younger days, life was comparatively well-ordered existence. The individual belonged to a group. He might be a member of a guild. He might be a member of a trade union. He could be a small shopkeeper or a small-town physician, but he had a niche. He had his place where he worked in the sense that he made his contribution to society. He lived within his means. It never occurred to him to live otherwise, and in spite of the fact that he might be surrounded by persons who had more than he had, this did not seriously discomfort him because he did not regard wealth as a symbol of superiority. He knew enough from personal experience or observation to realize the miseries of the rich. He realized they were not enjoying what they had. Instead of enjoying it, they were servants to it. Buddha points this out very, very clearly, namely that those who do not have much live miserably because they do not have more. Those who have much live in misery for fear that shall be taken from them. And everyone shares a common anxiety. This was quite according to natural law and procedure. Now, When we come into the financial situation as it is, we realize we have lost something. We've lost leadership. We've lost the guidance of the authority of principles. One of the principal factors in this situation has been materialism. Materialism has focused the mind entirely upon this small span of time, which we call a lifetime. Materialism has made it mandatory that success be achieved here, and that success here is the ultimate purpose of existence. In order to make this realistic, in order to be able to sell the idea on all levels of society, materialism must in some way interfere with the cultural morality of antiquity. The materialist must not look forward to any life beyond this one. He must realize that it is his privilege, as one of the Roman emperors is supposed to have said, to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die. The Romans were a little smarter, however, because whenever they had a great feast, they reserved one seat at the head of the table and placed the skeleton in it to remind all there that life was fleeting and that the inevitable was close at hand. But in this problem, the concept of accumulation built around materialistic attitudes of life made it very valuable to some people to think in terms of material possessions. These material possessions might be a piece of land, a building, or valuable personal properties. Whatever it was important. Yet we have no record at the present time that any materialistic substance or possession can have a continuous effect upon consciousness. It must be left behind. Why then should we become so desperately dedicated to accumulations, which at best are only loaned to us? We own nothing. We only own our own souls, and we do not generally find it sufficiently important to try to raise money on them. The materialistic position can only result ultimately in an overestimation of false values. If we are not aware of true values, then we substitute values that are not true and satisfy ourselves by the immediate accumulation of things, rather than to contemplate the ultimate consequence. This world is a very interesting place and has a great many dimensions that are worth a lot of thought. The human being can have a very interesting life, and also a life that is very profitable in terms of things he can take with him. Among the things that he can take with him, according to the Egyptians, are the attributes of his own soul. His soul power is a universal medium of exchange. It goes beyond anything that belongs to this world. Now the power or treasuries or wealth of the soul are friendship, love, thoughtfulness, dedication, the improvement of the mind and heart, the accumulation of wisdom, and the practice of charity. These have soul values, and when the Egyptian jurors weighed the soul of the dead, these are the things that they estimated. What has the individuals done that makes it proper for him to expect a better future? He will go on to be what he was intended to be. Now, when we get started on the problem of material existence and begin to estimate how much we can do with this small ball floating in space that we call the Earth, we kind of take on the attitude that in some way or other, this little ball is going to sustain our concept of wealth. We want to investigate this little ball very carefully, but we do not investigate it to find out what it means in a cosmic plan of thing. We measure it in order to determine how many mortgages we can put on it. It becomes a problem of using the Earth as collateral, and we are getting into some trouble. We like to think perhaps of this planet as like a bubble, an alchemical retort, a round transparent bubble, and in this bottle there are all kinds of hidden treasure. Everything under the surface of the Earth is filled with all kinds of potential sources of good. Even the moisture that causes the plant to break through the surface is part of the evidence of an eternal life in the Earth. But if, for instance, instead of nurturing this, we are working not with it, struggling to preserve and protect it, using the Earth with a sense of responsibility to the creating power, if instead of this, all we do is exploit the Earth, there is a compensation which we do not like. For instance, we are going to be faced more and more with the petroleum problem, and we are going to fight, struggle, and buy and sell and trade and swap and steal to control the available fuel resources. We forget this Earth is a bottle, and that it only has so much in it. And when once what is in it is gone, and it takes millions of years to replenish an exhausted petroleum field. Therefore, this whole situation is fraught with the greatest danger, and this danger is summed up in the concept of profit. We are willing to sell our birthright for a bowl of potash, in this case, a bowl of petroleum. But we are using our means for the wrong ends. What we should be doing is trying to understand the world we live in, trying to know what the world rewards and what it punishes, and learn how to use and not abuse what we have. In Rome once, an old farmer dug up a pot of gold in his field when he was plowing. He didn't know what to do with it, so he wrote a letter to the emperor and he said, "I have found the treasure in the earth. What should I do with it?" The emperor wrote back 2 words, "Use it." The farmer thought for a while, and then he wrote another letter to the emperor and said, "I don't know how to use it." Again, the emperor returned with 2 words, "Abuse it." Now, this is more or less our problem. Not knowing how to use what we have. We misuse it. Instead of attempting to cooperate with a value that is far beyond mind, we are bound together in a struggle for worldly possessions. Now, this does not mean that we should go off the deep end and all impoverish ourselves. This is not the end. The end is understanding. The individual who is pried loose from his wealth is in a very unhappy condition, but the individual who outgrows excessive possessiveness is a very wise person, and we need more of that kind of person at the moment. So here we are in a situation which has been intensified by materiality. Now, materialism is an attitude. It is something that some people seem to come by naturally. Others achieve it by great effort, and still others have a thrust upon them. But in all principle and in all fact, materialism is simply a point of view. It is an attitude towards something. It would have remained such had not been for the fact that it has been scientifically organized. Science, coming along without a religious leadership, has been aided and abetted human selfishness. It has devoted its researches and most everything that is done to prove materiality, to prove that we live in a world in which skill takes precedence over honor. We have become very skillful, and for probably the 100 years from the middle of the last century on, we've become increasingly proud of scientific progress and increasingly indebted to its production. Now, science has done a lot of good. No one is going to say that it has not. The principles of science are philosophical, and they go back to the dawn of time. Man began to be a scientist the moment he decided to improve his state. Science in itself is not bad. We're not running down scientific achievement. What we are concerned with is the fact that science is not self-disciplined. That science, instead of advancing the cause which it should be advancing, has gotten sidetracked. An astronomer looking out in the sky cannot but be impressed by the magnitude of the universe and the comparative insignificance of himself. We look out upon an orderly way of existence. We are now not only hunting out galaxies, we are looking for holes in them. We are going on exploring space, but something about this exploration has been frustrated. When we explore space, what does it mean? What do we learn from the recognition of an infinite reality superior to anything that man can even understand? How are we going to advance scientifically unless the scientist thinks beyond the boundaries of materialism? Not only are we indebted to him for the exploration of nature, but we are indebted to him for all kinds of byproducts. And as we study these byproducts, we realize that many of them are also completely focused upon materiality. We find an educational system which is deficient in the most important thing in the world, and that is the spiritual conviction. We find every profession, every art, every trade becoming more skillful, becoming better able to administer its various activities, but with little or no insight as to meaning. The meaning is lost. Where the meaning is lost, where the idealism fails, where all principles are downgraded to a large degree, where we are entertained only for the benefit of the advertisers, we are gradually becoming more and more disillusioned and gradually being internally injured by an attitude which is unworthy of a human being. This means that we are coming gradually to an impasse. We're trying to project materialism and make it the key to the universal procedure, and it is not. And no materialist has ever been able to prove that it is or ever will. We are losing our souls, just as surely as Faust sold his immortal soul to Mephisto for a few years of riotous living. This lack of the basic integrities has produced another effect. We have lost this constellation of spirit. We are undermining the friendship of nations, and we are having massive difficulties with racial problems. We have all these difficulties and we have no remedy. So the only thing we do is fall back upon a misuse of what we think might be a remedy, and that is to focus all our attention upon wealth. Wealth is something that you reach out and touch. Wealth is something that you can spend the day well. It is something you can accumulate for good or no good reason. But wealth becomes the goal of life. Just as the ancient Greeks dreamed of being better, the modern dream of being richer. We have taken materialism supported by science, perpetuated by education, and have now accepted it as the key to universal security. This is simply poor thinking. In fact, it is so impoverished that it almost denies our essential humanity. Therefore, wealth is now the guiding spirit. It has taken over, and everything is measured in terms of it. The materialist, not believing in anything after death, has still further reason to enjoy the moment. When enjoying the moment, we find that wealth is not only something that has to be accumulated, but has to be administered. Now, one thing we should learn, and nature properly would uphold us in this lesson if we would ever settle down to it, is that wisdom is the proper use of what we have. Wisdom means that we should apply all of our effort and our worldly goods to the advancement of something that is superior to the delusion of superiority. We need to have, therefore, some approach that will give us a key to the situation. At the moment, we may say that science has not the high reputation that it had 50 years ago. We do not look upon it as we did. Even new mythologies such as Star Wars don't completely compensate. In fact, it almost illustrates the problem. Actually, we are now in the midst of a positive application of the universal law of cause and effect. Science, without understanding, without spiritual leadership, without integrities that come from philosophy, the modifying forces of art and literature, the testimonies of history, and all the other contributing factors, science is in serious trouble. It has given us, far as we can judge, the ultimate dilemma, the hydrogen bomb. With this, science could wipe out not only man, but also itself, destroy everything that which has been accomplished, because that accomplishment was not built upon a solid foundation of internal integrity. As long as we continue to exploit the universe, we will suffer from our own exploitation. Wealth, therefore, must be used. Millions of dollars, billions of dollars have been contributed to the advancement of science. Therefore, those paying the bill have a right to know that what they have supported is supporting them, that it is accomplishing for each of us a better life, that it is building securities instead of fomenting insecurities, that it can look forward to centuries of peaceful cohabitation between creatures upon this planet. Science should have led us to a golden age, but it got us in trouble. It got tied up with the age of gold, and they are different things. So the use of money becomes the next responsibility. Use or lose, to mention an old adage of Ben Franklin, and that was a very good one. If you have and you want to earn what you have, suppose you inherited it, suppose you get it as in return upon your investments, whatever it is, whatever is your opportunity is your next responsibility. Therefore, it is up to the individual and the society in general to make sure that those things which we have are rightly used. If they are rightly used, we justify them. If we use them as they should be used, there could be no reasonable complaint against them. Something must happen to cause the individual to assume responsibility for the use of what he has. This responsibility means thoughtfulness. It means that the person settles down to the wise administration of his own affairs. It means that he carves his appetites, that he strengthens his morality, that he functions upon the level of ethics and is consistent and reasonable in his conduct. These things deserve wealth, whatever it may be, because it means that ultimately this wealth will be returned to its own source and the whole world will be better. But what about the individual who doesn't think? He comes home with a very substantial paycheck. He doesn't realize, of course, that no matter how big it is, it does not actually represent value. But having received it and having more of it than he had before, what does he do? He goes into various extravagances, and at the present time, alcoholism is one of the byproducts of money, not well used. Another byproduct is narcotics. Another byproduct is luxurious and extravagant means of life that transcends the necessary, the reasonable, and the proper. Now, it is the extravagance of the rich that has brought about practically every revolution in the history of the world. The individual who thoughtlessly and in vanity advertises his superior financial standing is a danger to his community. The great Japanese shogun Ieyasu Tokugawa was well aware of this, and when he became the military dictator of Japan, one of the first things he turned his attention to was the bankers of Osaka. The bankers were a very close-knit fraternity, and in the trading with the Netherlands and later with other countries, they were very prosperous. Pretty soon, their wives and daughters, even themselves, began to show evidences of luxury. The ladies wore the most expensive fabrics. The gentlemen wanted to have the most expensive fittings on their swords and on their sashes. The children were dressed to kill. Everyone was going along, living it up, to use a Japanese term, Ieyasu saw this, and so he simply passed the law. Any person of wealth who exhibits this wealth excessively shall have his entire fortune confiscated by the state. It was taken away from them. He said, if we do not curb extravagances, if we continue to confront the people with misuse of wealth, it will destroy the nation. He lived around the early 17th century, but he made his point very clear, and it made it stick, that ostentation is the basis of anarchy. Now, we all know these things if we read history. The decline of the Roman Empire tells you the whole story, but why are we continuing in this way? Why are we overlooking? Why are we allowing a perfectly wonderful life to be wasted by dissipation? Or why we allow a thoughtful mind to be dedicated only to trivia? Why is this possible in a world in which man has been endowed with higher faculties and powers? Well, one of the answers, of course, lies in this problem of the lack of philosophical guidance. Someone asked in a newspaper not long ago for the name of 2 or 3 outstanding American philosophers. The editor replied, "There are not any." There are plenty of scientists and economists to burn, and there are also all kinds of politicians, but there are no philosophers. And this lack of true philosophy has corrupted music, art, literature, clothing. It has corrupted human relationships, is contributing to crime. It is breaking homes. It is creating millions of narcotic addicts, because now cocaine is one of the symbols of luxurious living. What's happening? Values have been forgotten. The true reason for wealth has been forgotten. The proper use of what you do must be restored. If you want to dissolve the existing problem, there is no other solution. Discipline in this case needs leadership. Now, where do we go for leadership in idealism? Well, we can look around and it seems to be in short supply, but we have a tremendous reservoir of it which we are neglecting, and that is religion. Religion has been in head-on collision with materialism, because when materialism discounts religion, its own position is impossible. It is easy to deny religion than to correct the faults of science. But in spite of all the ups and downs we have on this planet, a reservoir of probably 2.5 billion religion-oriented people, it is the largest existing social group. It excels all others in number and in basic instruction. It has much to contribute. We still study the history of the Roman Empire. We will study the problems of the Renaissance. We will try to investigate what was wrong with Medici, and we will also try to prove conclusively why Alexander died under the Battle of Babylon. And yet in our public school system, we are afraid to even mention the world's greatest unit, religion. There's no other part of human society that is more significant, has a longer and more unusual history, has had more ups and downs, and has been the cause of greater good than religion, and yet we are not even allowed really to consider it as a part of an educational system unless we go to a theological seminary. Now, we are praying in harmony with the idea that probably is not proper in a democratic country to favor one religious group or another. This is in violation of a constitutional amendment, which is primary and proper. But to face the facts frankly, there is no reason why religion cannot be part of education, for it can be studied as one of the major institutions of human society. We should never be afraid or ashamed to mention it. We can approach it historically. We can approach it philosophically, but we do not need to become involved in theological disputes. But we are without some kind of idealism, and where are we going to find it? Where are we going to find an idealism that is a substitute for the Sermon on the Mount? Why do we need to substitute? So our monetary system, in order to straighten itself out, should read Scripture a little more attentively to find out what it's all about. Our present economy that we are so proud of is not practical. It's not factual. It cannot survive the forces that are now gathering around it. Unless it becomes enlightened, it must begin the problems or accept the responsibilities of the recognition of the responsibilities of success in any field or department of life. How could we go about to instrument this? We know that it's going to be heavily opposed. We know that everyone is going to have some reason why he doesn't want it. But the fact remains that gradually, that which we cannot control, and that his destiny is stepping in. What men cannot handle, he must leave it to heaven, and up to the present time, heaven has been keeping the galaxies in fair order for uncounted billions of light years, so we might have a little confidence in it. In the sense of the word, then, we notice with marked interest that what man does voluntarily assume he has thrust upon him. Within the last 25 years, there has been a great resurgence of religion. The individual who has placed a condition absolutely precarious to his survival is beginning to think in terms of his own inner life. There are probably more persons attending church at the present time in proportion to the population than ever before since the end of the 18th century. We are gaining the realization that we must change ourselves, and we must gradually build our foundation not upon a material anthill, but upon an internal integrity which is invaluable. This change is making inroads in every phase of our living. We are becoming more addicted to the idea of solving something. Communities are taking over their own projects. There is greater consideration for the unsolved problems, and most of the leaders in these better movements are either religiously or philosophically oriented. They believe in something above matter. They believe in something which can bestow upon mankind a true and proper guidance, a guidance which can lead him out of the present dilemma. One problem, I imagine, is the same that faces nearly everyone, and that's fear. Fear can be a very dangerous and terrible thing, but the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, according to the Bible. Now, the translation of that word fear from the original Hebrew is not the best choice of words. It is not terror or something of that nature. Fear, in this case, is used more or less philosophically to suggest or imply that we are afraid of our own evil, that we fear the law of life if we break it, that we therefore should rather not break it and not bring down retribution upon ourselves. But actually, man in his fear is looking for some place to turn. He's looking for a place to find means to get home. He's beginning to be afraid of inflation. He's afraid of energy limitations. He's afraid of corrupted ecology. He's afraid of his neighbor. He's afraid of every institution which has exploited him down through the years. Therefore, fear ends in a kind of philosophical desperation. The individual finally decides that he has to reorient his own life and put his faith in that which there is a right of faith. The model of the country "In God We Trust" is coming true. We are beginning to realize that it is not entirely safe under existing conditions to trust anything else. So to find this faith, we have to look inside. We have to take the experiences of the day and distill them from something valuable. We cannot turn away this experience because we didn't like it and accept this failing because it seems pleasant. We're going to have to get down to basics, to a real foundation and value. It will come. Many people are very much disturbed and disappointed, as always, but I think very much definitely will come. We are going to wake up. We were created to wake up, and it's been a long and tedious procedure, but in spite of all of his mistakes, humanity has survived. He is here, he is on, and he is working, and little by little he is beginning to discover a heart in his work. He's beginning to see that if he uses the natural resources of his planet wisely and unselfishly, we can all live together in comparative security. We can find ways of making our lives useful and beneficial, and a source of inspiration inside of ourselves. Under such conditions, if we land in the judgment hall of Osiris, we will pass with shining honor. We will be safe, and our safety beyond this life is beginning to be more important to us. We are beginning to realize that there are many things we have hoped which are not going to happen. But we must recognize that no individual who is dedicated to principles can fail. Failure is a term in economics, which means you do not succeed economically. But real failure has nothing to do with economics. It is primarily to do with the lack of internal growth. Therefore, a challenge is the most important thing in the world, and at the moment, the challenge of our economic system is the most pressing problem that we have today. We are talking constantly about trying to balance a budget. We are not in any position at the moment to balance it according to the best we can find out, because we think we have it balanced in one direction. It dips over the other. We are not going to be able to balance a budget until we integrate ourselves as human beings. If we're able to do that, which is right, we will realize that all of the benevolences of life come from a power beyond ourselves. The fruit on our trees, the grass that grows under our feet, everything that we have belongs to a natural law, a natural procedure in space. We can benefit from it. We can be wonderful gardeners in the garden that has been given to us, but when we subdivide it and sell it off, we are in trouble. The world is a world ruled by one divine plan. This divine plan does not object to the reasonable use of an economic system. It does not forbid or prohibit accumulation, but it does demand right use. And right use is something that we have to think about quite a bit these days. I remember many years ago in New York, I talked with a very successful woman who was in finance. In those days, she was not able to sit on a stock exchange and had to work through brokers. But she had a large estate, and one day we were talking and she said, there's nothing in the world that I would enjoy more than to become aware of the philosophic and religious values of life. I would like to settle back to contemplate some type of reality beyond the stock market. I can't. I'm completely locked. Every day is another problem. If I do not keep my mind on this, I will be wiped out. I have to give my life to protect what I have. Someday, we're going to have to realize that we must give our lives to protect something that we are, and that if what we have makes it impossible for us to grow, then we are in a very serious situation. So our problem with money is to use it as it was intended, as a medium of exchange, as a way of accomplishing a simpler social relationship, as an indication of the integrity of the seller and the buyer, and to make possible involved transactions in a world ever increasing in population, which must find ways to universalize its needs. We have to have these media, but they have to be in the hands of enlightened persons. They have to be freed from over-ambition. They have to be freed from monopoly. They have to be freed from ulterior motives, and we have to learn the truth about some of these factors and situations. There is a revolt against most of the prevailing institutions simply because we can't live with them. Because they make us sick. We are forced to take on in daily living exploitation policies, which make us sensitive to values that do not actually exist and lose sensitivity to that which is true. The beginning of wisdom, the beginning of solution is that human being must grow, and this growth is going to come and he cannot prevent it. But the main point is that when growth begins, the individual must be open to it. He must be glad that it happens. He must value a magnificent experience far above a possession. He must put the possession of his own life in his own hands and lead it correctly. We've been given a kind of free will, which is really only a power of choice, as Aquinas points out. We have the right of making decisions, and day by day, more people are making better decisions, and these better decisions will ultimately prevail. But they may only come when situations become so desperate that we cannot survive without them. We are going to grow. We're going to succeed. We're going to use the instruments we have created. We're going to use all that science can give us. We're going to use philosophy properly. We're going to use our economic system constructively. We are going to organize our industrial structure so that all will have a fair part in the resources of nature. We will gradually integrate our religions, breaking through barriers of creed until finally we come into the realization that religion is merely man's effort to interpret from within himself the great laws of life under which he lives. These things will come because man will survive. I noticed coming down here this morning a little piece of property where there was stones set together, and between two little blocks of concrete so close together that you could hardly put a knife blade between them, a little plant was growing. It was just a little weed, and it was certainly having a hard time, and yet it had adjusted to its need magnificently. It survived what would normally be called an irresponsible and inevitable defeat. It survived because there was life in it, and that life was stronger than concrete. That life was going to be lived if there was any human possibility or natural possibility for its survival. We are much more important than that little plant, though perhaps in the universe it might take precedence in some matters, but in general, each individual has survival built in. He has the power forever to overcome that which he outgrows, become wiser, better, nobler in all of his dreams, in all of his aspirations. Success, eternal fulfillment is his, and a great cycle of lives which he must live. Life after life ensures the ultimate salvation of all that lives. The main thing is not to make it quite so hard on each other right now. If we're all going to survive, if we're all going to be ultimately enlightened and true and honorable, cooperative and loving and frenzy, we might as well start now as wait until we get some more black and blue marks. There's no reason why, if the end that we seek is peace, that we shouldn't start to do everything we can to promote it now. And while we cannot always change others, we can come gradually to a relationship with life by which we understand the eternal benevolence that guides us through sorrow and misery, to the fulfillment of our own purpose. Children make mistakes, but they outgrow them because they learn better. We are children. We have made mistakes. We are making mistakes. The only problem that is important is that we shall outgrow them. We will outgrow them by living above them, by changing our own attitudes toward them, by using all material things as symbols, as spiritual values and spiritual realities. We need to have our dollar bill ensouled, and that cannot be done at the mint. The ensoulment of a $1 bill is up to the individual who holds it in his hand. If he uses it wisely, he gives his own soul to it, and it serves the common good. If he uses it unwisely, it is but an empty body to go down to mortality. So it is up to us to ensoul the good by putting new spiritual dimensions upon the institutions that could serve us well, but which we have permitted to fall into decline because of our own selfishness. We cannot be selfish and happy. We cannot be over-ambitious and live in peace. We cannot break the rules of life without a power that is greater than ourselves stepping in. We know this from experience. It is time for us to respect, regard, and love that power that steps in, for it is our hope of salvation. Now, if you listen to this particular lecture looking for tips on how to make money through Manly P. Hall, you probably are not going to find them. This lecture is sort of a big picture view of money historically and in general, and the need for us to find spirituality in the present moment and to move beyond an understanding that money simply will buy us things. Because it can do that, it can buy us things and it can do things, but in many ways, the system of money and the way it works now has sort of poisoned us and moved us away from our spiritual beginnings. If we go back to our spiritual understandings of abundance, then many of these things don't matter. So it's an interesting discussion of money on a historical basis and a reminder for us to know that money is not just about buying stuff. It goes beyond that. It's a medium of exchange. And money isn't the key to our lives. It's much more that we are trying to achieve and go through, and the enlightenment of our age is coming, and it will come, and we're just kids and children, and that is all that's happening. We're just kids right now. There will be a point in our future, in a new earth, where money will not be that important, where we can create any material thing, and the materiality that we're seeking becomes irrelevant. But in any case, I'd love to get your ideas of this particular discussion. You can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com. And welcome to The Reality Revolution.